Hi, everybody. This is Paul Bryan of STRAT. Today I'm talking with Angel Steger, who is Director of Design at Facebook. Hi, Angel. Welcome to the Stratosphere.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, before we get into this interview, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely. So I studied architecture and then quickly found my way into tech accidentally through friends. I've been a hybrid product and design leader for about 14 years. Um, Most recently found myself back in design by accident when I was trying to sell my startup. But I've been loving it so far, and I'm sure as many of you have experienced personally, as you grow into leadership, the roles kind of blur anyway. So, at some point you're just sort of being responsible for your products and your users and your team.
Okay, well, you've been at quite a few household names like Pinterest, 23andMe, Dropbox, and now moving on to Facebook. How did that come about that you were in all these kind of marquee companies?
Well, it certainly was not intentional. Many of these weren't really marquee companies until later. So 23andMe, I joined through a friend of mine, and really was just, I love biology and was very inspired by their mission of speeding up the time it takes for genetics research to impact the lives of everyday people. There's so much suffering in the world, and if you can alleviate it by bringing cures to people faster, that's a tremendous contribution to humanity. And then, joined Pinterest through an acquisition conversation, um, and just really loved getting to explore design as a craft. Learned a ton about design and growth from Pinterest, and then most recently was at Dropbox, leading the growth team there, and focusing on both customer growth and business platforms. So, experimentation tools, as well as the experiments then leveraged by those tools.
Okay, so growth has been kind of a thread in the different stops that you've made. Can you tell me what you mean by growth? How does that impact products, services, experiences that people are designing?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So for me, growth is really, it's not about a set of tactics or hacks. It's specifically about like, how do you connect customers to value? And that could be through first discovering what that value is, and then later figuring out specifically how to deliver that value in the most impactful way. I don't view it as like a hairstyle on top of a product. I believe that growth is inherently a strategic approach to making your product successful by being deeply in touch with your customer.
Okay, but what the customer gets, I mean, they used to say $1 on the table or $1 for the bank is $1 less for you somehow. So how do companies get to that balance between what they give their customers and what they get?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to choose your business model very carefully. I think if you, for example, look at the canonical gym membership, right? Like there's more gym members than can ever truly attend the gym. And so the gym membership is actually incentivized against you successfully going to the gym multiple times, because like that just means that they can't actually deliver the service. And so the gym model is actually mostly based on a breakage model where you pay for about 3 months and then churn, but you didn't really go that much. And it's basically based on your lapse of interest and engagement. So it comes at a cost to you, and it's not in line with your motivation. Um, that said, when you look at other types of businesses, for example, most SaaS, for example, like I was most at Dropbox, you will be willing to pay Dropbox if the product value you're getting is greater than the cash money value you're putting into it. And so we're always looking to create that kind of happy, uneven economics where you're feeling like it's tilted in favor of you as the customer, and assuming your business model isn't misaligned with what customers actually want. There is no difference, but it depends on like your business. And so part of what I've looked at through most of my career is actually like, how do I align my efforts with a business model that successfully supports that? And one of the reasons why we ended up selling my startup or disbanding it was actually because even though we had great product market fit, we weren't able to make the economics of that model work. And so, we were doing English language learning as a service. And, you know, the scale of what it took, the number of teachers to students, it wasn't going to be a venture-sized business because there's certain types of teaching that you can't scale mass. And like conversation is one of them. You can't have a conversation with like 5,000 people. And anyone who's like spent a lot of time in commenting will have realized that. But yeah, you know, if you want to learn how to speak with people, you got to actually speak with people, and that means you have to have a conversation of a certain scale. And you know, if the teacher needs to have this amount of expertise, which means that they need to pay this much be paid this much per hour, and then you have students around the world who have a high level of appetite but have only a certain amount of economic access, like you inherently have a problem. So it doesn't work in every situation. You have to be picky.
Right. No, when the pandemic hit, I was thinking about opening up a gumbo shop because I'm from New Orleans. And then I realized I'd only be making like about 5 cents per bowl after I figured it all out.
Yeah.
Another word you use a lot is experimentation. And so how does experimentation fit into growth and strategy?
Yeah, well, it is sort of the bread and butter, meat and potatoes food analogy of choice of growth, which is, you know, fundamentally we start from the standpoint of not knowing always what's going to work, right? Like you can have hypotheses, but if you're trying to learn as quickly as possible and eliminate bad paths as quickly as possible and find a path of success, you need to try a lot of different things. And, you know, I think sometimes people believe that experimentation has a look or a size or something like that. And I don't think that's true. I think also sometimes people think in order to learn, you have to code an experiment. And I think that's like also not really true. I think there's a lot of different media with which to experiment. And oftentimes people over-rotate on getting to code where like you could probably have learned the same amount with maybe a prototype or maybe even just a conversation with the right customer base.
Okay, well, I need some enlightenment because when I hear experimentation, first of all, when designers talk about experimentation, it feels like the rules of reliability and validity don't apply anymore, and that talking to a few people is actually going to be representative of the larger population. And then the other piece, I don't know, the other issue I have is it seems like some companies like a Delta Airlines or a Home Depot, they have lots and lots of customer data. So to experiment, I don't know, it feels kind of like trial and error rather than let's use our knowledge to the best extent we can. Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, let me see if I can restate it accurately.
Yeah,
So the first part that you mentioned, which is that like, you know, sometimes we can believe that talking to a few people represents everybody. And I think that it can get you a proxy, but like it's always a proxy, and same thing with experiments. They're a proxy, and metrics are a proxy. So, you know, you can talk to people who are representative of your segment that you're trying to work with. And you might be able to understand, for example, like why people feel a certain way about something. You can kind of understand the values and principles behind how they make decisions or what they're looking for. You know, you're going to want to sample enough to identify a pattern, right? Like if you only talk to one person, like you have no idea if that person's an anomaly or not. Right. So there's a certain amount of like mass that you need to establish some sort of pattern, and you need a way of understanding like, okay, from that like small subsample that we took, how representative is that sample, right? And you see this problem. This problem is not new. Like if you look at the history of, for example, political polling, like it's been around since polling existed. And that's, you know, so it's like over 100 years. And then, you know, or I don't know if polling's 100 years old, but it's pretty old. Anyway, and then
in qualitative research, I mean, there's evidence that you've talked to enough people and that if you keep talking to people, you're going to keep getting similar answers. I mean, there's a confidence factor there. It's not a, you know, statistical, but it's a confidence factor, right?
Yeah. And also like what you're learning when you talk to people is what they will tell you, right? And so, you know, what people say is not necessarily what they will do, right? Like, you know, we all have like I remember in the early days, I'm going to age myself here, but like, okay, so remember Facebook, or not Facebook, Friendster, and remember MySpace, and like when everyone used to spend all of their time on a profile because there was no home feed, so people were basically publishing to their profile. And so what happened was people were like constantly sculpting and resculpting their self-image for the benefit of other people. And so you'd see people's, MySpace profiles, and they're like, oh, like I love reading, and like I listen to like Beethoven and Mozart. And it's like, no. You are listening to like, top 100 hits and all of your guilty pleasures, and you're not, the books that you're reading are like, junky sci-fi romance novels. But that's not what they're going to say, because they're trying to represent themselves in a certain way. And like, human beings will say one thing and do another thing all the time. And so like, that's the benefit of aligning qual and quant together. And the other part, of course, is that like a lab setting is not necessarily indicative of how people will behave in different contexts, right? Like, we activate very different sides of our personality and very different sides of our decision-making processes, depending on like, what parts of our minds and emotions are being activated in a given situation. And so, to truly understand how people will behave at scale, you actually have to just look at how they behave at scale. But experimentation can kind of get you a little bit closer to a sample of that scale. So higher than what you can get from quantitative research, unless you've got a ton of money, but you
Sure.
might not necessarily know why they're taking a certain behavior. So, if you like have this new feature and you put in front of people quantitatively, they may engage with it, but you don't know if that's because that feature is what they wanted, or because they thought it was something else and they're like, oh, that other thing, I really like that.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually where I think design has a really important role to play in terms of experimentation, because a lot of product strategy and growth strategy in particular is often very theoretical, but like how you deliver on that strategy and the execution actually makes a huge difference in terms of how people engage with your experiment or not, right? Like if you have an experiment where all you have on a page is a giant button, it doesn't actually matter what the button says, because people will just click a button at random because there's nothing else to do. And like, someone who looks at the results and be like, 100% of people who land on this page click the red button, red button success, red buttons everywhere. They're like attributing a lot of causality to and like false intention to what that gesture actually means. And so like you have to know that like what the user is interpreting your experience to be is in fact what the experience is, in order to know that your data is anything but garbage.
Okay. Interesting. And you're moving now into a role at Facebook. Can you tell me a little bit about that role?
Yeah, so I will be a design director of a team called Interop, which works on cross-app experiences. So, Facebook has a lot of apps, right? Like Messenger, Facebook, WhatsApp, Lite, etc. Many people in the world are users of all of those apps or some of those apps. They move across them. So like how should people move across the apps? Certain functionality is very similar across apps. So like what functionality should be the same? What should be different? Should they feel the same? Should they look the same? I think there's a lot of things like that to explore. I think it's super interesting, especially having an architectural background. It's very exciting to me because it's sort of like meta architecture of products. And then also as a growth person, I'm very used to working horizontally across product and feature teams. And so this is like starting to be more horizontal across just like products. So get to talk to a lot of people, have my thumb in quite a few pies, and should be lots of fun. We'll find out.
Yeah, and some people represent product design as a double diamond, from a while back from Chicago Design Management Institute. Which diamond are you mainly working in this new role? The
It's
strategy
the whole
side?
thing.
Both strategy and
Yeah.
execution. Okay.
Definitely there's features and functionality that the team owns specifically, and then there's other things where we will be collaborating and jamming with other product teams on.
Are you primarily going to be on the innovation side of things where you're doing some discovery work? Or are you going to mainly be on, let's connect this wire to that app and make things flow more smoothly in this way?
It should be both. Yep.
Oh, okay. All right, awesome. Um, you use the word strategy a lot, and I guess before I let you go, since we are UX Strat, I'm just wondering, what role do you see as strategy playing from a design perspective in a company like Facebook, where mainly these products are what they produce, versus in a more traditional environment like a bank or a retailer where optimization is more relevant? How does strategy play a role in a more digitally focused company like Facebook?
Um, well, I'm glad I get the Facebook question because I don't know how to answer that for a bank since I have no experience working in a bank. Um, but I think strategy is super important because um, you know, if you're familiar with the concept of like synecdoche, so like synecdoche is like the how a part can symbolize the whole or represent the whole or like complete the whole. So like, if you imagine like a picture frame and like one corner is missing, like synecdoche would be like completing that corner. And like, when you're building products, even if you're building something that like hasn't existed before, like all of the things that you create come together to create this overall image of like what it is that you do and what value you deliver. And like, as you add new things, that shape changes. And so you have like the role of strategy, and why strategy matters is because you're designing the whole thing. You're not just designing the piece, and you always have to keep in mind like the parts to the whole, right? Like when I was at Dropbox, one of the things that we worked on was our acquisition team focused on like our website, which is a primary acquisition lever. And, depending on how you direct people through your marketing site to sign people up, like, you either create profit from one area more or less. And, you hope that people get into the right product for them. But like, you know, many companies will use tactics that sort of drive people towards certain kinds of revenue streams because those teams are incentivized for particular revenue streams. And then the overall shape of like what it is that you do and like who you're doing it for can become distorted if you're not careful. So you have to be intentional the whole way through. And not just from a planning standpoint, but then like executing on it and making sure that you've in fact gotten to the future that you envisioned, which I think is always hard. And I think is, especially when you work on products that involve many people behaving, can be very unpredictable. So it's a very delicate art, and I have a lot of respect for people who have managed some pretty sophisticated trade-offs.
Yeah, well, it seems like design has been a pretty fun ride for you. As you look into the near future, what are you excited about? Are there any experiences that involve design, um, physical, digital things? What do you look forward to being a reality in the future?
Um, Quite a few things. I mean, I'm one of those people who's a chronic malcontent, so I'm just so excited for like people to get out there and create better things that don't suck. Like rage is a major source of inspiration for me.
Wow.
And so like, things that I both rage and want to be better, and also get value from, which is why I'm raging, because I don't rage about things I don't care about, is like one, I think social fabric, like more than anything right now, like how we feel connected to other people, especially during COVID, both for work and interpersonal, I think is so, so important. And if you get it right, it's so deeply meaningful and rewarding. My whole family has been like jamming together on Messenger actually. And it's turned out to be really delightful, but it can continue to be better. Same thing with like many experiences on Zoom. So many things to love, but also like so many things where you're face palming. And I think another area that I'm really excited about is there's just so much there is still so much of the world that has yet to go through digital transformation. Like there's so much of human time and energy that is drudgery and repeat work and carbon copy pieces of paper. You know, like I met some folks on the Uber Freight team a while ago, and, you know, they were talking just about like how much inefficiency there is in terms of like the cost of goods based on the transportation dynamics being very inefficient. And then also things like, you know, the fact that, you know, for example, women that drive trucks, if they're only getting jobs through a human broker service, they don't get as many jobs and they don't get paid the same amount. Whereas like, you know, if it was purely managed digitally through a system, it would be a much fairer system. And so like when I think about things like that, where you're like, okay, so there's like huge amounts of people that are spending their lives like tracking down things on paper and making phone calls, and like that's their life, you know, and like their energy, and they could have more of that time spent on something that is meaningful, fulfilling work that would actually be performed better by machines. Like there's like literally like very little downside. I think that's really exciting, especially when it comes to human labor, because time is a resource that ultimately is the only thing that we really have, and it can be spent wisely or it can be spent poorly, but either way is going to be spent. And so, you know, when the things that we create enable people to have a truly meaningful experience of their time, you give people life. And I think that that's amazing.
That is a beautiful way to end this interview. Thanks so much for spending time with me today.
Thank you, Paul. It's been an honor.